The Appalachian wilderness of the 18th and 19th centuries was both a refuge and a prison. Cut off from the institutions of urban governance, these isolated valleys were ruled not by formal law, but by customs carried across the Atlantic from Scotland, Ireland, and the borderlands of Britain. Among these customs was a harsh doctrine of blood retribution, a belief that every killing demanded balance, that a feud left unfinished dishonored both the living and the dead. Yet the cost of such balance was not always extracted from the blade of the killer. It was often carried, silently and unwillingly, by the women left behind. For a widow, the death of a husband did not simply mark grief, it marked a transaction. In many clan-dominated communities, she was not viewed as an independent soul, but as an extension of her husband's household. His property, his name, his labor. When he died violently, the widow did not gain freedom. She became an unsettled debt. The custom that emerged was cruel in its efficiency. If a man was killed, the killer's family might offer a peace settlement to prevent further retaliation. But this peace was not bought only with livestock, land, or coin. It was sealed with flesh. The widow of the slain could be compelled to marry the very man who had destroyed her life, or a close relative of his clan. The justification was chilling. Such a union would prevent the feud from spiraling, binding two rival families through shared bloodlines. There was no question of choice. Refusal could bring starvation, violence, or expulsion. The geography of isolation left little room for resistance. Survival depended on land access, kinship protection, and communal standing, all controlled by the same clan leaders who orchestrated these marriages. A woman who resisted could find herself abandoned, stripped of property rights, and left to wander a landscape where the mountains themselves became executioners through hunger and cold. Accounts recorded by ministers, travelers, and later folklorists reveal the grim regularity of these arrangements. One widow, whose husband had been murdered during a quarrel over pasture rights, was forced to remarry within weeks, her new husband none other than her husband's killer. The community accepted it, not with celebration but with a grim practicality. To them, this was reconciliation. To her, it was bondage without chains. The widow's body thus became a weapon of policy, wielded not by her own hand, but by men whose decisions reduced her existence to strategy. Her grief was erased, replaced by the cold arithmetic of clan preservation. Every child she bore thereafter was marked by contradiction. Half the lineage of the murdered, half the lineage of the murderer. In this way, the cycle of feud was not broken but internalized, living on inside her bloodline. Religion offered little reprieve. Frontier churches, often more concerned with maintaining fragile unity than with individual suffering, seldom intervened. Ministers recorded these unions in marriage books without comment, legitimizing what the community demanded. The sermons preached patience, obedience, and endurance. The widow's tears were rarely noticed beyond the walls of her cabin. The cruelty was not merely emotional but material. In many cases, widows lost all legal claim to their first husband's property once remarried. The land that might have sustained them was transferred to the control of the killer's family, further binding the widow in dependence. Even her children from the first marriage could be reclassified, raised under the authority of the new husband, taught to honor the very man who had ended their father's life. Such practices echoed ancient customs across Europe and the Near East, where forced widow remarriage had long served as a mechanism to preserve clan stability. In the Old World, these were often justified through law codes or religious precedent. In Appalachia, they persisted because the wilderness offered no counterbalance, no court, no state, no sheriff strong enough to override custom. What remains most haunting is the silence of the women themselves. Their voices survive only in fragments, in second-hand accounts, in bitter remarks passed down through oral history, in scattered diary entries where grief seeped through the ink. One widow wrote, "I am bound to the man who killed my joy. My children will not speak their father's name without his shadow upon it." Her words reveal the suffocation of an identity rewritten by violence, the transformation of mourning into servitude. The psychological toll cannot be calculated, but its weight lingers, Every forced remarriage ensured that a widow's grief was never private. It became public currency, bargained in the name of peace. What should have been healing turned instead into captivity. By the late 19th century, as formal legal systems spread deeper into Appalachia, such practices began to decline. Courts and state officials imposed alternative resolutions, and the visibility of outside authority diminished the unchecked dominance of clan law. But for over a century, countless widows lived and died under this grim expectation, their fates woven into the feud, their suffering buried beneath the language of reconciliation. What endured was not harmony but trauma, etched into family genealogies where lineages bore the scars of coerced unions. The feuds themselves passed into legend, romanticized in ballads and stories, yet the widows remained largely forgotten, their chains invisible, their endurance unnamed. The practice that trapped Appalachian widows in forced remarriage did not begin in America. Its roots lay deep in the soils of Europe, centuries before the first settlers cut paths into the wilderness. To understand its power in the mountains, one must first trace its journey, from ancient law, through medieval custom, and finally into the cultural memory of those who carried it across the ocean. Among the Anglo-Saxons, widowhood was a state tightly bound by property and inheritance. A woman whose husband died was not treated as an autonomous individual, but as a vessel of wealth transfer. Her dowry, her labor, her very body were intertwined with the survival of the clan. Marriage was not only personal, but contractual, ensuring that land and bloodlines remained secure. When death disrupted this order, society demanded restoration. That restoration was seldom gentle. One of the most enduring forms was levirate marriage, a practice by which a widow was compelled to marry her deceased husband's brother or closest male relative. Though widely associated with biblical law, the custom survived in varying forms across medieval Europe. Its rationale was consistent. The widow must not remain unbound, for her remarriage outside the family threatened to disperse wealth, land, and children into rival hands. To prevent this, she was bound inward, sealed again within the family that had already claimed her. Such marriages were rarely optional. Legal codes in Anglo-Saxon England gave widows little space for refusal, and even where church law nominally emphasized consent, social pressure was overwhelming. Refusal meant isolation. Compliance meant captivity in a house that had already witnessed death. For many women, widowhood was not an end but a transfer, like property passed along from one male guardian to another. When Scots-Irish settlers left for the New World, they carried these customs with them in memory and practice. Generations of life on the British borderlands, a region scarred by clan feuds, raiding, and fragile alliances, had hardened the logic of inheritance. There, marriage was less about affection than about survival, stitching together families who might otherwise spill each other's blood. In that harsh world, the widow became both symbol and solution. She embodied tragedy, but she also embodied opportunity, the chance to bind rival houses, to silence vengeance through enforced intimacy. Crossing the Atlantic did not dissolve these ideas. Instead, it preserved them. On the Appalachian frontier, where isolation mirrored the old borderlands, familiar patterns reemerged. There was little formal law, few courts, and no standing force to regulate disputes. Families fell back upon memory, upon what had governed their ancestors in times of bloodshed. Inheritance customs became feud customs, and widows once again found themselves ensnared in decisions made without them. The cruelty deepened in America because the frontier magnified both violence and dependence. In Europe, at least some widows could appeal to ecclesiastical courts, to noble patrons, or to written charters that acknowledged limited rights. In the wilderness, no such refuge existed. Authority belonged to kinship alone. A widow who resisted remarriage risked more than ostracism. She risked starvation, for her access to land, crops, and protection depended entirely on belonging to a recognized household. What began in Anglo-Saxon codes as inheritance law evolved, in the mountains, into a method of ending feuds. Where one man had been killed, his widow became the instrument of peace. She was expected to cross the boundary between families, binding herself to the very bloodline that had spilled her husband's. In that coerced intimacy, the echoes of levirate tradition grew darker. twisted into a logic where survival demanded submission. The church did little to challenge this transformation. Frontier ministers, often struggling to hold scattered congregations together, recorded such marriages with the same ink they used for baptisms. Scripture itself, with its references to levirate marriage in ancient Israel, was sometimes cited as justification. What mattered was stability, not suffering. And so, the widow's silence became sanctified, woven into the very fabric of community life. Over time, this inheritance of cruelty became normalized. Children grew up watching their mothers, aunts, and neighbors bound into unions they did not choose. Songs and stories softened the brutality, recasting enforced marriages as reconciliations. Yet beneath the surface, trauma lingered. Every forced union carried unspoken grief, every child born of it a reminder of blood spilt. The cultural memory of Old World law had crossed the Atlantic not as wisdom, but as a wound, one that blawed into every cabin and clearing where a widow sat powerless. It is tempting to imagine that such customs belonged only to distant, foreign times. But in the mountains, they persisted well into the 19th century, long after Europe had begun to shed them. What was discarded in one land was preserved in another, hardened by isolation and violence. Appalachia did not invent widow inheritance. It inherited it with all the cruelty intact. The result was a system where women's grief was never their own. It was managed, redirected, weaponized. A widow's tears were not seen as signs of mourning, but as symbols of unfinished business, to be resolved through remarriage. The old laws of Anglo, Saxon, and Scots-Irish society had crossed an ocean and taken root in new soil, where the stones of the frontier pressed down even harder upon women's lives. The Appalachian frontier was a place where survival depended upon reputation. Land, kinship, and honor formed the scaffolding of life, and each could be torn apart by violence. Feuds were not isolated acts of anger, but spirals of retaliation, sustained by memory and fueled by pride. In this system, every death carried a debt, and that debt had to be paid. The simplest form of payment was blood. When a man was killed, his kin expected to strike back, to spill the life of the killer or another man of his clan, yet unchecked retaliation threatened to unravel entire communities. Families could be extinguished, neighbors could become enemies, and settlements could fracture into ruin. Out of this danger emerged a grim calculation: feuds could be managed, not ended, by forcing bonds between enemies. The instrument of those bonds was marriage. A widow delivered not to safety, but to her husband's killer, her grief converted into a tool of negotiation. In this blood feud economy, women became collateral. Their bodies were not seen as sacred, but as instruments of peace treaties, their marriages arranged not in celebration, but in dread. When a widow was forced to remarry into the very family that had slain her husband, it was presented as a gesture of reconciliation. Yet beneath the surface, it was less reconciliation than enslavement. It stripped her of choice, erased her mourning, and bound her to the household of her enemy. The rationale was brutally pragmatic. By marrying the widow into the killer's clan, her kin were trapped. To avenge her husband's death now meant striking at the family into which she had been absorbed. Her children, too, would bear blood from both sides, complicating the lines of loyalty. Violence became tangled, and the clarity of revenge was dulled. What seemed like mercy was in fact manipulation, ensuring that the widow's suffering became the cornerstone of peace. The economy of feud worked through fear. Refusal was rarely possible. A widow who resisted could find herself ostracized, abandoned by her husband's kin, and denied the resources needed to survive. Her property rights were tenuous at best. Without the protection of male guardians, she could be stripped of land and forced into dependency. Hunger and isolation enforced compliance more effectively than chains. Historical accounts preserve the chilling matter of factness with which these arrangements were treated. In one community, a widow was compelled to marry her husband's cousin, who had personally struck him down during a drunken quarrel. The settlement was described by elders as a binding, a word heavy with double meaning. It bound families together, but it also bound the widow in captivity. She bore children into a house where every gesture, every silence, reminded her of the murder that had shattered her first life. What makes the blood feud economy so haunting is its reduction of human lives to currency. Men traded vengeance for access, traded blood for flesh, traded grief for silence. A woman's consent was irrelevant. Her body was valued not for her will but for her usefulness in preventing further violence. Even her children became part of the calculation, living testaments to an enforced peace that was built on their mother's subjugation. Religion lent uneasy sanction to these customs. Ministers and elders often justified the unions by citing the need for community stability. Feuds, they warned, could destroy not only families but entire settlements. Better that one woman endure humiliation, they argued, than that dozens fall in an endless cycle of bloodshed. In such reasoning, the widow's suffering was erased beneath the language of necessity. Her silence was demanded, her endurance praised as sacrifice. But beneath that surface of stability lay unspoken cruelty. Forced marriages were not reconciliations, they were erasures. They silenced women by binding them to the very households that had made them widows. They transformed private grief into public bargaining, and they ensured that the cost of male honor was borne most heavily by women who had no voice in the transaction. Over generations, the practice hardened into expectation. Children grew up hearing stories of widows remarried into enemy clans. The songs that later romanticized feuds ignored the suffering of these women, painting reconciliation as noble while concealing the chains beneath it. In folklore, the feud became legend. In reality, it was an economy built upon the subjugation of the most vulnerable. What lingers most chillingly is the psychological violence. To live each day beside the man who had taken a husband's life, to raise children who bore his blood, to cook his meals and lie in his house. This was captivity not of iron but of memory. Every gesture was a reminder. Every silence was a wound reopened. These were not marriages in any true sense. They were enforced truces, signed in flesh rather than ink. By the late 19th century, as outside legal institutions spread into the mountains, the blood feud economy began to weaken. Courts, sheriffs, and state laws introduced alternatives to private vengeance. Yet by then, countless widows had lived and died as bargaining pieces, their suffering absorbed into the fabric of mountain life. Their stories were seldom written down. They remained ghosts in genealogies, shadows in family lore, erased from the romantic legends of feuds that celebrated male bravery while ignoring female captivity. The blood feud economy reveals not only the cruelty of violence, but the way it was managed. It shows how human suffering can be transformed into a resource, calculated and deployed for the survival of clans. And it reminds us that behind every legend of mountain feuds lies a silence, the silence of women who were forced to bear the heaviest cost of peace. In the mountains, death did not end with the burial. It marked the beginning of calculation. When a man was killed, his widow did not simply inherit his absence. She inherited his obligations, his debts, and his vulnerability. To the clan, she was never just a grieving woman. She was property, a resource to be distributed. Appalachian records from the 19th century reveal how deeply entrenched this belief was. A widow's status was determined not by her will, but by the decisions of male relatives and community leaders. If her husband died in a feud, her household became contested ground. Her land, her children, and her labor were absorbed into whatever arrangement brought the feud to its uneasy close. Often that meant she was forced to remarry into the very clan that had created her grief. To them, she was not a life in mourning. She was spoils. Oral traditions preserve chilling examples. In one mountain settlement, a widow whose husband had been shot during a quarrel over timber rights was seized by his killer's family. Within weeks, she was remarried, her cabin and fields transferred to the new household. Neighbors recalled the transaction without outrage, describing it as settling accounts. The woman's feelings were never recorded. What mattered was that the feud was bound, the land secured, and the children placed under male authority. Such stories reveal the stark reduction of women's humanity. In this system, a widow was considered an extension of property, no different from a field or a cow, something that could be reassigned to stabilize conflict. Her grief was irrelevant, her wishes ignored. Even her children were treated as assets, folded into the authority of the new husband who claimed her. Their loyalties were redirected, their memories overwritten, as they were raised beneath the roof of the man who had erased their father. The cruelty was reinforced by law and custom alike. Formal inheritance rights were fragile in frontier Appalachia. With few courts and scattered officials, property claims often depended on communal recognition. A woman who attempted to hold land in her own name risked losing it through force or neglect. Her survival depended on submission to whichever man the clan deemed her new guardian. In this way, the widow's autonomy was erased not only by custom but by the practical realities of isolation. Churches, too, played their part. Ministers solemnized marriages between widows and the kin of their husbands' killers without protest, recording the unions as legitimate acts of reconciliation. By doing so, they granted divine sanction to what was essentially captivity. Sermons urged obedience and endurance, praising women who accepted their lot as examples of Christian patience. Behind the language of faith lay a brutal truth: religion was used to sanctify the treatment of women as property. The silence of the widows themselves haunts the record. Rare diary entries reveal despair muted by resignation. One woman, remarried within a month of her husband's death, wrote, "I am taken like the land he left, as though I were soil to be plowed by another hand." Her words speak to the stripping away of personhood, the reduction of identity to a resource. Her grief was transformed into duty, her body into a bargaining chip. The oral histories of Appalachia often romanticize the feuds, turning them into tales of honor and vengeance. Ballads sung of brave men and bloody conflicts, but the women appear only as background figures, absorbed into new marriages without question. Their erasure from the cultural memory is itself a form of violence, a denial of their suffering. The songs conceal what the reality exposed: that widows were traded, claimed, and absorbed, their lives dictated by the same logic that divided land and livestock. It is easy, from a modern distance, to imagine these women as powerless victims. Yet the tragedy is sharper. They were not even regarded as victims at all. Their suffering was invisible to the community, hidden beneath the language of necessity. Neighbors did not see cruelty in their forced remarriages. They saw resolution. The widow's silence was taken as consent, her compliance as reconciliation. The fact that her humanity had been erased was never acknowledged. By treating widows as property, the feud system ensured that violence lingered not only in blood, but in daily life. Each forced union embedded trauma into families, shaping generations that lived with the memory of captivity. Children inherited not only divided bloodlines, but divided loyalties. Growing up in households where the absence of their fathers was never spoken of except as a debt that had been settled. As state authority reached further into Appalachia, courts began to offer widows some protection, granting limited rights to land and inheritance. But by then, countless lives had been reshaped by the cruelty of custom. The stories of women taken as spoils remained largely unspoken, hidden beneath the surface of family lore, remembered only in fragments. Their humanity had been denied twice: first by the act of being claimed, and second by the silence of history. In the Appalachian highlands, the feud did not merely kill men, it imprisoned women. When a widow was forced into remarriage with her husband's killer or his kin, her existence shifted from grief to survival. The cruelty lay not only in the marriage itself, but in the endless years that followed. Each day became a negotiation with memory. Each night, a silent surrender. Accounts of these women rarely survive in detail, but fragments of testimony, letters, and oral traditions reveal the depth of their torment. The widow was expected to share a roof, a table, and often a bed with the man responsible for her devastation. To refuse was to invite starvation, exile, or further violence. To submit was to live each day as a prisoner in the household of her enemy. Neither path offered freedom. Psychological torment defined this captivity. The act of lying beside the man who had taken her husband's life stripped her of dignity. It demanded not only obedience, but a performance of acceptance. A widow could not openly mourn. To weep too long was seen as defiance. She was required to resume the rhythms of life, cooking, child-rearing, and labor, as though her first marriage had been erased. The absence of mourning became another form of violence, one that silenced grief and rewrote memory. In some cases, women resisted. Oral traditions recall widows who fled into wilderness cabins or sought refuge with distant kin. Their defiance, however, was short-lived. Without community recognition, they were cut off from resources and land. In a world where survival depended on the collective, independence was almost impossible. A woman alone was a woman condemned. Some starved, others were hunted down, beaten, or returned to captivity under threat of death. Resistance carried its own execution. The cruelty extended into motherhood. Children from a first marriage were forced to live under the authority of the man who had erased their father. For the widow, this was a torment beyond words, to watch her children grow within a household ruled by the enemy. To know they were being taught loyalty to the man she feared. Even the children born of the second marriage were a reminder, living symbols of coerced union. Their faces carried the blood of her oppressor, binding her further into captivity. The terror of this existence cannot be measured in physical suffering alone. It was the erosion of self, the steady obliteration of identity. Women were forced to live with contradictions that gnawed at the soul to nurture children who embodied both love and violence, to perform the role of wife to a man who had turned them into widows. In this way, the feud consumed not only bodies but minds, ensuring that trauma lived on long after the gunshots and blades had fallen silent. Religion compounded the torment. Ministers counseled obedience and preached submission. Sermons exalted the widow who endured her new lot, without complaint, praising her as a vessel of peace. In doing so, the church sanctified her captivity, declaring her silence a virtue. For the widow, there was no escape in faith. Her endurance was transformed into religious duty, her suffering rewritten as sacrifice. The oral record offers rare glimpses into moments of resistance that slipped through this silence. One story tells of a woman who, after being forced into marriage with her husband's killer, refused to speak a word to him for years. Her silence became her only weapon, a refusal to give him the intimacy he demanded. Yet even this act of defiance came at a cost, for it condemned her to isolation within her own home, her grief unspoken, her life reduced to endurance. Exile, starvation, execution. These were the punishments for women who defied the order of things. The cruelty of the system lay in its absolute submission or destruction. There was no third path, no refuge where widows could claim their own fate. The community's survival was always deemed more important than a woman's life, and her suffering was justified as necessary to prevent further bloodshed. The psychological toll echoed across generations. Children raised in such households absorbed the silent despair of their mothers. Trauma became part of family memory, carried not in words but in behaviors, in silences at the dinner table, in the unspoken rules of loyalty, in the fear that simmered beneath daily life. These unrecorded legacies reveal how the feud system extended its cruelty long after the conflicts themselves had ended. By the time formal legal systems began to erode these practices, the damage had been done. Countless widows had lived entire lives in forced captivity, their stories erased from history, their torment disguised as reconciliation. The legend of Appalachian feuds remembered the bravery of men and the blood they spilled, but it seldom remembered the women who endured the lifelong punishment of survival. For the widows, death might have seemed kinder than the life imposed upon them. Their captivity was not measured in years but in silence, a silence that endured long after their names were forgotten. They were not asked to choose their origins. They were not given the right to separate the name of their father from the hand that had killed him. These children, born of marriages forged in violence, stood at the uneasy center of Appalachian life. Their very existence was both a wound and a binding thread, proof that a feud had been resolved, yet constant reminder of the blood spilled to achieve it. On the frontier, life rarely allowed for mourning, and widows forced into remarriage rarely found the dignity of silence. When they bore children to the man who had murdered their first husband, the community read this as submission, as proof that order had been restored. But for the women themselves, each birth was a new layer of trauma. The child became both salvation and sentence, a life that secured their place in a household, but also a permanent reminder of the violence that had brought them there. Appalachian traditions, shaped by Scots-Irish inheritance law and centuries of European custom, valued children less as individuals than as markers of property and continuity. A son born of such a union could bind land, livestock, and bloodlines into the killer's household, erasing the legal claims of the widow's former kin. Daughters, though considered less valuable in terms of inheritance, were equally important as instruments of alliance. A future dowry, a pledge of loyalty, a means of keeping rival families entangled. For the children themselves, life was a shadowed existence. Oral traditions and fragments of court records speak of children treated with a mixture of pride and suspicion. They were reminders of survival, yet also living proof of murder. Within their own families, they often carried the burden of divided loyalties. To love the man who raised them meant accepting the destruction of the one who came before. To reject him meant courting exile, hunger, or violence. Communities, too, participated in their silencing. To speak openly of the crime that lay at the root of their parentage risked reigniting feuds. Silence became a survival tactic, not just for the children, but for entire clans. Stories were buried, origins blurred, names carefully omitted from genealogies. What could not be forgotten was forced into secrecy, leaving generations raised under the weight of things unsaid. Anthropologists studying the remnants of these traditions have noted how kinship ties became a form of social control. A child born of violence was never simply a son or daughter, he or she was a binding contract. Where law was absent, biology became the mechanism of peace. But peace built upon coercion is fragile. The feuds did not truly end, they merely changed form. The violence lived on in the very bodies of the next generation. For some children, this inheritance meant rejection. There are accounts of youths who fled into the mountains rather than accept the roles their blood demanded of them. Others were raised with cruelty, seen as eternal debts rather than beloved offspring. A few were treated as symbols of reconciliation, praised for embodying the unity of warring clans. But even this honor was a burden, forcing them to carry on a narrative that denied their pain. What makes these stories most haunting is the silence of the children themselves. Their voices are absent from most records, their experiences filtered through legal notes, church sermons, and second-hand accounts. Yet the traces are enough to see the outline of their suffering. A court ledger marking the transfer of a widow's property to her new household is, in truth, a record of a child's displacement. A sermon on forgiveness that praises the birth of a child to reconciled families is, in truth, a demand for obedience at the expense of truth. The children of violence were not only heirs of property and lineage, they were heirs of fear. In their bodies, communities found the proof they needed that order had been restored. But for the children themselves, there was no restoration, only survival. Their lives were reminders that violence, once committed, does not simply vanish. It embeds itself into families, into names, into generations. The Appalachian Mountains carried their echoes for centuries. Genealogies still bear the faint marks of unions born from murder, though the stories that explain them have long been buried. And yet, when one looks closely, the silence is deafening. The children were not forgotten, they were deliberately obscured. Their lives tell the most haunting truth of all, that violence does not end with the dead. It continues in the living, in those forced to carry a name, a bloodline, and a history they never chose. Rebellion in the mountains rarely carried the sound of drums or the clash of steel. For widows, rebellion often meant a silent walk into the wilderness, a refusal to speak vows, or a knife hidden beneath a bed of straw. Their defiance was small, often invisible in records kept by men, but it was real, and it was costly. The system of widow inheritance relied not only on violence but on obedience. Communities needed women to comply, to submit, to merge the blood of slain husbands with their killers, ensuring cycles of retribution were contained. But not every widow bent to that logic. Some understood that their silence and submission were chains more lasting than death itself. Oral traditions from the Appalachians preserve fragments of their choices. A woman whose husband was killed in a drunken brawl refused to marry the man who struck him down. Instead, she fled deep into the woods with her children, leaving her family name behind. Stories tell that she survived by trading herbs, skins, and small charms, moving between cabins on the edge of settlement. In her disappearance, the clan feud did not heal. The killer's family saw her absence as dishonor, and bloodshed continued. Her act of flight was remembered not as cowardice, but as a dangerous kind of bravery. Others resisted more openly. Records from scattered court cases suggest widows who outright denied marriage could be branded as disobedient, a term that carried heavy weight in a culture where obedience to kin and clan was a survival law. Some were turned out from their homes, left to starve or wander, reduced to beggars in a society that had no place for unattached women. A few chose exile willingly, crossing ridgelines to find safety among rival families or distant kin. But exile often came at the price of isolation, suspicion, and eventual capture. There were also darker acts of resistance. Songs and whispered stories tell of widows who poisoned their forced husbands, slipping crushed roots into stews or mixing bitter herbs into corn whiskey. Such acts of vengeance, when uncovered, were punished brutally, hanging, beating, or worse. Yet even when discovered, they carried a strange weight of respect. A widow who dared to strike back embodied the rage many others swallowed silently. Ballads, sung in secret, captured the memory of these defiant women. Lamentations described the widow, who wept but would not kneel, the one who burned her marriage bed rather than share it, the one who walked barefoot into snow rather than bind herself to the man who killed her kin. These were not triumphs in the heroic sense. Most ended in suffering, exile, or execution, but they survived in song because they represented something dangerous, the refusal to be treated as property. For the clans who enforced inheritance, rebellion was more than disobedience. It was a threat to the entire system. If widows could resist, then blood feuds might never heal, alliances might never form, and men might be forced to face vengeance without the salve of forced reconciliation. In this way, women who resisted bore not only personal punishment, but collective condemnation. They endangered the fragile truce upon which clan survival often depended. Psychologically, their defiance revealed the unbearable cost of the tradition itself. These women understood that survival under such terms meant the erasure of self, that to remain alive in a forced marriage was to die in every other sense. To walk away, even toward starvation or death, was in some ways the only act of freedom left to them. What lingers most is not their names. Many are lost, but their shadows. Oral histories remember the runaway widow, the poisoner, the woman who vanished into the pines. They became archetypes, warning and inspiration alike. Children were told these stories as lessons in the dangers of rebellion, but also as whispers of another possibility. Within communities bound by violence, the silent rebellions proved that even in chains, defiance was possible. These acts, scattered and often crushed, never dismantled the custom. Widow inheritance persisted, reshaped, and enforced by generations. But each defiance left a scar in memory. Each story, whether told in shame or admiration, preserved the truth that women were not only victims. They were agents, however limited, of their own refusal. The silence of the rebellions was louder than submission. They broke no wars, they ended no laws, but they left an imprint on history's darker pages. Proof that even within one of the cruelest traditions, some women refused to surrender fully to violence. Marriage, in the shadow of murder, was rarely private. In the Appalachian hills, when a man killed another, the settlement that followed was staged as theater. The widow was the centerpiece, her body the unwilling proof that vengeance had ended, her silence the stagecraft of peace. Communities gathered not to comfort her grief, but to consume it. The ceremonies often took place in open clearings, churchyards, or the porches of log courthouses where justice was supposed to dwell. Instead of sacred vows whispered before God, there were muttered bargains between men. The bride was not asked whether she consented. She was displayed. Witness accounts and oral ballads describe scenes where women were dressed in mourning black, only to be marched to the arms of the man who had spilled their husband's blood. Some were paraded with veils torn from their heads, their hair left loose and disheveled. A signal of shame, a visible reminder that they no longer belonged to themselves. Children clutched at their skirts, confused and terrified, as kinfolk forced their mother into the grasp of the killer. The ritual humiliation served a double purpose. For the clans of men, it sealed a truce. For the women of the community, it was a warning. The sight of grief inverted, of a weeping widow forced into the role of bride, taught every onlooker the price of resistance. Those who dared to object were silenced with threats of starvation or exile. In more extreme cases, a woman who refused was dragged by force to the threshold, her cries becoming part of the spectacle. One 19th century court record from Kentucky tells of a widow whose brothers refused to hand her over. They argued that her husband's death had been murder, not feud, but the opposing clans surrounded their cabin and threatened to burn it with everyone inside. When the woman finally emerged, she was made to walk barefoot through mud to the home of the man who had shot her husband in a cornfield dispute. The community cheered not out of joy, but relief. The cycle of killing had paused. Her degradation was the price of their fragile peace. In other instances, these marriages were framed with mock ritual. Some were forced to walk 3 times around the killer's homestead, symbolizing her transition from widow to possession. In certain tales, the killer would smear ashes on her face, declaring her cleansed of her old life, as though her love and loyalty could be erased with soot. These acts twisted elements of Christian rite and folk tradition into instruments of cruelty. The humiliation did not end at the wedding. Many widows were denied the right to speak during the ceremony. Others were commanded to serve the feast that followed, to pour liquor for the same men who had laughed at her husband's death, to smile with trembling lips as if peace had been willingly chosen. The community watched, their silence complicit, their eyes drinking in her suffering like another form of entertainment. Even music, meant to soften the air of weddings, turned into mockery. Old ballads were altered to fit the moment, sung with cruel humor. "The widow's tears are wine tonight," one fragment recalls. Such verses stripped the event of dignity, reducing grief to parody. These spectacles reinforced the truth that widowhood in Appalachia was never a private wound. It was a stage on which men acted out their dominance, and the woman herself became both prop and prize. Her humiliation was a ritualized reminder that her body belonged not to herself, nor to her dead husband, but to the clan's will. And yet, beneath the forced laughter and public jeers, there was always something unspeakably grotesque. A community that demanded peace through humiliation carried violence into the very fabric of its marriages. The feasts, the songs, the staged vows, all of it was theater meant to conceal a deeper horror, that peace had been bought not by reconciliation, but by the breaking of a woman's spirit. Not every woman submitted. Some endured the humiliation, the forced bed, the hostile household. Others, however, chose an ending that defied the demands of men and the expectations of the community. Madness and suicide were not merely private tragedies in the mountains. They were public ruptures, reminders that even the strongest structures of custom could not contain all human grief. Accounts from oral traditions, fragments of court records, and whispered stories preserved in ballads all testify to the same haunting truth. Some widows preferred death to marriage with their husband's killer. Their lives, already shattered, became unbearable under the weight of imposed peace. When communities forced their grief into silence, their voices returned in more terrifying ways, through madness, mutilation, or self-destruction. One tale, repeated across Appalachian valleys, tells of a woman who hanged herself in the rafters of the cabin where her husband had been shot. The killer, who had demanded her hand as reparation, found her body swinging above the hearth. Local storytellers said she had tied the noose with her husband's hunting rope, as if to bind her loyalty beyond the grave. Her suicide became a warning, sung in hushed tones. Better the rope than the bed of the killer. Another story records a woman who cut her own face with a knife before being led to the marriage. In a culture where a woman's worth was often tied to her appearance, this act was a violent refusal. Her scarred flesh declared she would not be claimed as a prize. She was forced into the marriage nonetheless, but her mutilation lived on in memory, a disfigured face that haunted generations, proof that some women found resistance even in self-harm. Court transcripts from the mid-1800s mention women who drank poison or threw themselves into rivers rather than walk to the altar. Their deaths were rarely spoken of openly. Communities covered such events in silence, for to acknowledge them would be to admit the cruelty of the custom itself. Instead, these deaths slipped into whispers, becoming part of the shadow history of the mountains. Madness was another escape, though less final and perhaps more terrifying to those who witnessed it. Widows, stripped of their homes and autonomy, sometimes retreated into worlds of hallucination. Neighbors told of women who wandered into forests barefoot, speaking to trees as if to the spirits of their husbands. Others sat rocking endlessly by empty hearths, repeating the names of their children until the sound resembled a chant. These broken minds unsettled entire communities, for they were living reminders that grief, when crushed, can devour itself from within. In ballads passed down, madness is often portrayed as both tragedy and resistance. One song recalls a widow who, after being forced to serve whiskey at her own binding feast, began laughing uncontrollably. She laughed at the killer, at her kin, at the preacher himself. Her laughter did not stop. For days she wandered the settlement with a hollow grin, her voice echoing like mockery. In some versions of the ballad, she finally threw herself from a cliff, her laughter carried away by wind. The tale blurred the line between insanity and protest, a madness that mocked the entire ritual. The suicides and breakdowns unsettled the fragile peace that forced marriages were meant to secure. A widow's death reopened wounds between clans. Her madness cast shame upon both families, for it exposed the violence that lay hidden beneath the language of reconciliation. These outcomes proved that not all lives could be bound into silence. Some would resist, even if resistance meant destroying themselves. Communities responded with fear. Women's suicides were sometimes described as curses, omens of further bloodshed. Stories circulated of households haunted by widows who had chosen death, their shadows said to linger at cabin doors or in the forests where they perished. Whether believed or not, such tales gave voice to the dread that the custom carried within it. The knowledge that peace, secured through humiliation, was not peace at all. These deaths also carved deep scars into the memory of children. Sons and daughters who watched their mothers unravel carried the burden into adulthood. Some grew silent and withdrawn, others violent, repeating the cycle they had witnessed. The suicide of a widow was never hers alone. It left a wound in the community's conscience, though few dared to name it as such. In the end, the women who succumbed to madness or suicide were not erased. They became warnings, not against defiance, as the men intended, but against the cruelty of the custom itself. Their choices, though tragic, preserved a kind of agency denied to them in life. In refusing to live as the property of their husband's killer, they spoke with their deaths. The mountains remembered, in whispered stories around winter fires, in half-forgotten ballads sung by grandmothers, in the uneasy silence of old cabins. The memory of women who chose madness or death endured. They stood as haunting proof that some burdens were too heavy, that some grief could not be forced into silence. Their broken bodies and wandering minds became monuments, not to weakness, but to the unbearable weight of a tradition that demanded the living surrender to the will of the violent. The story of widow inheritance in Appalachia is not simply one of clan tradition or violent custom. It is also a story of law, or rather, of its absence. The cruelty endured by widows was not hidden from those who claimed authority. Judges rode the same roads, sheriffs lived in the same valleys, and preachers blessed the same families. They saw, they knew, and yet they turned away. The American Republic prided itself on liberty, on the rights of man, on the sanctity of contracts and property. But in the dark hollers of the Appalachian mountains, those promises dissolved into silence. For the women trapped in widow inheritance, there was no courthouse strong enough to shelter them. When disputes over land or livestock reached the courts, records were carefully kept. Deeds, boundaries, and debts filled the dockets. But when a widow was claimed by her husband's killer, When her body and children were folded into a forced marriage, the law grew quiet. Family justice, officials called it. Matters of kinship, they insisted, were beyond the reach of the state. It was not ignorance. Reports trickled outward. Circuit riders, travelers, even missionaries carried whispers of the practice to distant ears. Yet time and again, courts shrugged. To prosecute a man for taking his slain rival's widow was to tear open the fragile peace of entire communities. Lawmen feared vendettas more than they feared injustice. Order, however bloody, was preferable to open war. Some cases made it onto the margins of legal record. In Kentucky, a widow testified before a county judge that she had been claimed against her will. Her children threatened if she fled. The judge listened, nodded, and declared it a domestic arrangement. No charges were filed. In Tennessee, a circuit court clerk recorded the property transfer of a dead man's farm to his killer, justified not by deed but by the fact that the widow consented to the marriage. Consent wrung from fear was still written as law. Churches offered no greater refuge. Pastors, bound to their flocks, often presided over the grotesque ceremonies themselves. They preached that union brought peace, that God willed reconciliation between families, yet the reconciliation was only for men. For women, the sermons became shackles. To resist was not just to defy custom, it was to defy God. The silence of law carried a cruel message: widows were not citizens to be protected but property to be transferred. They could appeal to no higher power, for every official who might defend them weighed their suffering against the risk of blood feud. And in that calculation, the widow always lost. In some communities, sheriffs did worse than turn away. They enforced the ritual themselves. Accounts survive of deputies escorting widows to ceremonies, ensuring no escape before the vows were forced upon them. In the eyes of the state, this was not a crime. It was order restored. The few women who tried to resist through legal petitions found their pleas swallowed by bureaucracy. Court clerks misplaced affidavits. Judges delayed hearings until the matter was settled at home. A woman might ride for days through mountain passes to reach a county seat, only to be told by a solemn, faced official that nothing could be done. Then she would ride back, her body still her captor's property, her hope extinguished by the very law she had trusted. This complicity revealed something larger. America's frontier justice was never blind. It was a bargain struck between violence and silence. Men claimed the right to kill, to inherit, to bind women into marriages of blood. Courts looked away. Churches sanctified the union, and communities swallowed the screams. Even into the 20th century, scattered cases hinted at the endurance of this silence. A West Virginia sheriff, asked about a widow carried off by her husband's killer, replied bluntly, "That's family business. We don't tangle in that." No investigation followed. The woman vanished into a household where no law would reach her. For the widows, the betrayal was total. They lived in a republic that spoke of freedom, but none of its freedoms were meant for them. Their grief was not recognized, their voices not recorded, their suffering not written into the law's ledgers. Their bodies bore the scars of violence, but the archives of the state preserved only the neat lines of property deeds. When law looked away, cruelty did not merely continue, it hardened into permanence. Silence gave legitimacy. Every widow who cried for justice and was met with indifference was another stone in the foundation of oppression. By refusing to intervene, the courts made the custom stronger than any statute, and so the widows endured in a twilight world between legality and outlawry. Not criminals, not citizens, they became shadows in their own communities. Their fates were sealed not only by the men who claimed them, but by the very institutions that refused to see. The cruelty of widow inheritance did not survive because of tradition alone. It survived because the law chose to look away, and in that silence, entire generations of women learned that there was no justice waiting beyond the mountains. Only the echo of their own unanswered cries. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States presented itself as a nation of progress. Railroads threaded the mountains, coal and timber companies cut their paths into once sealed valleys, and reformers from cities spoke about education, suffrage, and law. Yet beneath this new skin of modernity, old wounds still bled. in the hidden corners of Appalachia, in the shadow of ridges where lawmen rarely climbed and preachers bowed to clan authority. The echo of widow inheritance still lingered. The practice had thinned by then. No longer universal, no longer openly demanded with the frequency it once had been. But it had not disappeared. Families carried memory like a scar that could not be smoothed away, and the old customs rose in whispers when a man was killed, when revenge simmered, when a widow stood exposed. Even if no one forced her hand, she lived beneath the weight of expectation. Many women who had been bound in such marriages decades earlier were still alive in 1900, still breathing, still carrying the chains forged for them in grief. They rarely spoke. When they did, it was with bitterness, often in private. Their words carefully measured so as not to shame their children. Children who were, after all, the product of those coerced unions. Oral traditions record fragments of their sorrow, not in the language of confession, but in the muted cadences of regret. A line in a ballad, a sudden silence when kin gathered, a remark half spat, half swallowed. My grief was never mine to keep. For the women themselves, this silence was its own form of punishment. The community saw them not as victims, but as vessels, women who had fulfilled their duty to bind the wounds of men, even if the stitching was done with their flesh. That they survived at all was, in the eyes of neighbors, proof enough of their obedience. Few asked what it cost them to endure. Fewer still cared. Yet the bitterness lingered, surfacing in subtle ways. Some women refused church communion, not as a declaration, but as a quiet withdrawal from a community that had betrayed them. Some avoided the graves of their first husbands, unable to bear the sight of headstones that marked love severed by violence and rebound by force. A few bolder spoke their rage in old age, when death neared and fear lost its hold. One widow, remembered in a faded diary, told her granddaughter, "I was made to wear my sorrow as another man's prize. The day I married him was the day I buried myself." The children, too, carried the long echo. They grew into adults haunted by lineage that bound killer and victim within their blood. Many never knew the full truth, their mother's silence shielding them from the horror of their own conception. But the community remembered. Whispers followed them. The boy who looked too much like his father's enemy, the girl whose eyes mirrored the murdered man. Silence was demanded of them, but memory was not so easily banished. The shame lay dormant, ready to surface in drunken arguments or in whispered gossip when marriages were arranged. By the 1920s, industrial labor had pulled thousands of mountain families into coal camps and lumber towns, scattering them into new lives. But even in these camps, far from the haulers of their youth, echoes of the old customs followed. Men joked grimly about winning widows the hard way. Women flinched at the sight of feuds reigniting, terrified of what would be demanded of them should the killing spill close again. Progress had come. Wages, company, housing, schools. Yet the cultural scar endured. What was most haunting was not the survival of the custom itself, but the way it had shaped generations of women's silence. In the broader world, movements for women's rights surged, suffragists marched, reformers called for equality in law and education. In the mountains, too, women taught school, organized churches, worked in mills. But for those who had been forced into widow inheritance, their voices were muted, their anger buried beneath decades of unacknowledged pain. They did not join public movements, not because they lacked the will, but because the weight of their past chained them in ways the world could not see. The cruelty of the custom lived on not in open practice, but in memory, in bitterness that was passed quietly from mother to daughter. A granddaughter might grow up never hearing the full story, only sensing in her grandmother's hard silence that something had been taken, something never returned. These fragments became part of Appalachian oral tradition, verses of old ballads, fragments of ghost stories, murmured warnings about men who carried knives and women who wept in silence. In this way, the long echo stretched forward, haunting not only those who had lived it but generations who inherited its shadow. Modern law could not erase memory. Courts could declare widow inheritance a relic of the past, but women who had been bound by it lived on into the 20th century, bearing testimony in their bitterness. Their grief had never belonged to them. Their bodies had never been their own. Their stories, when told at all, carried not healing, but a warning that silence enforced by custom can outlive the custom itself. The long echo was not the sound of chains clattering, but of absence. The silence where a woman's voice should have been, the silence of graves unvisited, of children who never ask, of families that pretended not to remember. It was the silence of women who carried grief unclaimed until the end of their days. History remembers kings and generals, battles and treaties, but beneath those grand narratives runs a quieter, more terrifying thread, the fate of widows. To lose a husband was never only the loss of love or companionship. Across centuries, widowhood became a tool of discipline, a weapon wielded by family, clan, and empire alike. The grief of women was not theirs to keep. It was seized, reshaped, and repurposed into an instrument of control. Appalachia's customs of widow inheritance may appear barbaric in isolation, a grotesque ritual bred from the violence of a remote frontier. Yet when placed beside the long history of widowhood in other societies, the pattern becomes undeniable. The story of the mountain widow was not an aberration. It was a grim echo of practices older than the Bible, older than Rome, older than Europe itself. In the ancient Near East, widowhood was never neutral. The Hebrew Bible codified the law of levirate marriage. If a man died, his brother was compelled to marry the widow, ensuring that property and lineage remained within the family. To refuse such a union was an act of shame. The widow's body was reduced to a vessel, a conduit for inheritance, never a soul with desires of her own. What began as obligation hardened into captivity. From Jerusalem, the custom rippled outward. In Greece and Rome, widows faced other chains. Roman law allowed a widow some property rights, but remarriage was often compelled for political or financial advantage. An aristocratic widow might find herself married off within months, her grief irrelevant to the needs of the state. Even among the poor, a widow was expected to remarry quickly, lest she become a burden to her kin or a threat to social order. Medieval Europe sharpened the cruelty. In feudal society, a widow rarely retained ownership of her husband's lands. Lords claimed the right to dispose of her, selling her remarriage as though she were cattle. A nobleman could acquire an estate simply by taking the widow who came with it. For peasants, the story was harsher still. The woman without a man became an outcast, an omen of poverty, a mouth unwelcome at the table. Widowhood was not freedom, it was stigma. The Ottoman Empire too twisted widowhood into weaponry. Women within harems, once widowed, could be forced into remarriage that reinforced alliances. In villages, widows were marked as dishonored, expected to return to their husband's family or risk destitution. Across the Islamic world and Christendom alike, the pattern was familiar. The widow's will was erased by the louder voice of law and custom. When settlers carried these customs across the Atlantic, they did not shed them. In the Appalachian highlands, the traditions fused with frontier violence. Here, widowhood became more than inheritance. It became a mechanism for ending blood feuds, a way to seal the peace between families at war. But peace built on such foundations was no peace at all. It was a theater of domination, where the widow herself became the treaty, her body the parchment on which men wrote their triumph. Her tragedy was turned into performance. She was paraded, mocked, handed from one family to another as though her pain could be bartered. And when she resisted, the punishment was exile, starvation, or death. The cruelty echoed not only the feudal lords of Europe, but the ancient laws of Israel, Rome, and beyond. What binds these histories together is a chilling truth: widowhood frightened men. The woman without a husband was dangerous. She could claim property. She could demand vengeance. She could live without male oversight. And so, societies conspired to cage her grief, to remarry her quickly, to assign her to a new guardian, to strip her of rights until her mourning was no longer her own. The Appalachian widow who lay beside her husband's killer was thus part of a continuum that stretched across millennia. Her silence was the silence of widows in Jerusalem, in Rome, in feudal castles and Ottoman villages. Her humiliation was the humiliation of countless others whose names are long forgotten, but whose lives were bent under the same unyielding pattern. Yet ghosts remain, Oral histories in Appalachia still whisper of the women who endured, or who refused. Ballads sung in low cabins remember their suffering. Across the world, folk songs and legends carry similar notes: the lament of the widow wronged, her tears preserved in melody when words were forbidden. These echoes remind us that even when law and custom erased their humanity, the memory of their pain endured. And perhaps this is the truest inheritance, not the property men squabbled over, not the false peace purchased with a woman's submission, but the haunting legacy of injustice. Every society that weaponized widowhood left behind not triumph but scars, scars that linger in stories, in silence, in the unmarked graves of women who chose death over chains. The ghosts of widowhood still walk with us. They appear in literature, in superstition, in the unease that surrounds the figure of the lone widow even today. To study Appalachia is not to uncover an isolated cruelty, but to confront a mirror of humanity's darkest instincts. Across ages and empires, grief was never safe in a woman's hands. It was taken from her, shaped into a tool of power, wielded against her like a weapon. Appalachia's widows were not alone. They were part of a lineage of suffering that spans the human story. And in their silence, in their despair, in their defiance, they remind us of a truth too easily forgotten. Societies reveal their truest cruelty, not in how they treat their warriors, but in how they treat their widows.